The thunderous crack of gunfire echoed in the cold Montana night as Abigail Dawson clutched her husband's lifeless body on the floor of their modest homestead. Blood soaked through her skirts, her tears mingling with the crimson pool spreading beneath them. In that moment, everything she had built in her 24 years of life shattered like the window through which the bullet had passed. Montana Territory, 1873. The promise of land and opportunity had brought Thomas and Abigail west from Boston 3 years earlier. Now, at the cruel hands of a gang of outlaws who demanded their meager savings, she found herself utterly alone. The funeral was a brief affair. Few attended. They hadn't had time to make many friends in this harsh new territory. The Reverend spoke words that felt hollow to Abigail's ears as the bitter October wind cut through her black mourning dress. Mrs. Dawson, the banker, Mr. Willows, approached her after the service. "I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news regarding your property." His words barely registered as she learned the terrible truth: Thomas had taken loans against their homestead. With his death and no means to make payment, she had 6 weeks to vacate. "Where am I to go?" she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. Mr. Willows shifted uncomfortably. "I'm afraid that's not the bank's concern, madam." That night, Abigail sat alone in the cabin that no longer belonged to her, staring at the bloodstain she couldn't scrub from the floorboards. She had no family back east, no money to travel, and winter was fast approaching. The thought of what befell women without protection in these territories filled her with dread. 3 weeks passed in a fog of grief. Abigail sold what little she could spare: her mother's silver hairbrush, Thomas's pocket watch, but it yielded barely enough to keep food on her table. The nights grew colder, and her wood supply dwindled. On a particularly bitter evening in late November, with snow beginning to fall and her pantry nearly bare, Abigail made a desperate decision. She'd heard of a rancher several miles outside of town, a man named Keller Hammond, who kept to himself, but was said to be fair. Perhaps he would have work. She could do laundry, cooking, anything to earn enough to survive the winter. Dawn broke with a heavy snowfall. Abigail packed her remaining food, a heel of bread and some dried meat, and set out on foot, her threadbare coat offering little protection against the biting cold. The journey took longer than expected, the snow growing deeper with each hour. By the time she spotted smoke rising from a chimney in the distance, twilight was approaching, and her fingers had long since gone numb. The ranch was larger than she'd expected: a sturdy main house with a barn and several outbuildings. A corral held a few horses that stomped against the cold. Abigail's legs nearly gave out as she approached the door, her body shivering uncontrollably. With the last of her strength, she raised her fist and knocked. Keller Hammond had been stoking the fire when he heard the soft rapping at his door. It was unusual to have visitors, especially in weather like this. He grabbed his revolver from the mantel, a habit formed over 10 years of solitary living in the territory, and approached cautiously. "Who's there?" he called, his deep voice rough from disuse. When no answer came, he opened the door slowly, gun at the ready. What he found was not the danger he'd anticipated, but a woman nearly frozen, her face streaked with tears and snow, collapsing forward as the door swung inward. Keller caught her reflexively, the gun clattering to the floor. "Madam." "Madam," he felt for a pulse as he dragged her inside, kicking the door closed against the howling wind. She was alive but desperately cold. Without hesitation, he carried her to the fireplace, laying her gently on the bearskin rug before the roaring flames. He removed her snow-soaked coat and boots, replaced them with his own dry blankets, and set about brewing strong coffee. When Abigail's eyes fluttered open, she was momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings: the rough-hewn log walls, the mounted antlers, the smell of coffee and wood smoke. "You're awake." The deep voice startled her. She turned to see a man watching her from a chair pulled close to the fire. He was tall and broad-shouldered, perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair and a beard that couldn't hide the strong line of his jaw. His eyes, though, surprised her most, a clear, vibrant blue that seemed at odds with his weathered face. Abigail tried to sit up but found herself dizzy. "I'm sorry to impose." "No imposition when the alternative is freezing to death," he replied, handing her a steaming mug. "Drink this." Slowly. The coffee was strong and laced with something stronger whiskey, she realized after the first sip sent warmth cascading through her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Hammond, Keller Hammond." He studied her with careful eyes. "And you are Abigail Dawson." She clutched the mug tighter. "I came to ask about work." His eyebrows rose. "Work? In this weather? Why would you risk your life for such a thing?" The simple question broke the dam of composure she'd been desperately maintaining. Tears welled in her eyes as the words tumbled out. Thomas's death, the bank's claim, her dwindling options. Keller listened silently, his face betraying nothing as she spoke. When she finished, he stood and moved to a pot simmering on the stove. "You need food more than work right now, Mrs. Dawson." He ladled stew into a bowl and brought it to her. "Eat. We'll talk about the rest after." Abigail hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite touched her lips. She ate gratefully while Keller returned to his chair watching the fire. "I can cook," she said when the bowl was empty. "And clean. I'm good with a needle, too." "I could, Mrs. Dawson," he interrupted. "There's a blizzard setting in." "You won't be going anywhere tonight, maybe not for several days." Fear flashed across her face, the impropriety of staying alone with a strange man, regardless of circumstances. "You can have the bedroom," he continued, seeming to read her thoughts. "I'll sleep out here by the fire. I've got a ranch hand's cabin about 50 yards from here, but Jonas is visiting his sister in Billings until spring. I couldn't take your bed. You can and you will." His tone brooked no argument. "Now, there's more stew in the pot if you're still hungry." That night, Abigail lay in Keller's bed, surrounded by the unfamiliar scent of him, leather and pine, and something uniquely masculine. The sheets were surprisingly clean, the room spare but tidy. On the bedside table sat a single book, Walden by Henry David Thoreau, and a small daguerreotype of a woman with Keller's eyes. Sleep came easier than it had since Thomas's death. The howling wind outside no match for the solid walls of the ranch house and the knowledge that, at least for tonight, she was safe. Morning revealed a world transformed, snow piled high against the windows, the landscape beyond an endless expanse of white. Abigail found Keller already awake, cooking breakfast over the stove. "Hope you like flapjacks," he said without turning. "Coffee's fresh." "Thank you," she replied, suddenly aware of her rumpled appearance. She'd slept in her dress, but it was wrinkled from the journey and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. "I apologize for my state." He glanced at her then, his gaze lingering a moment longer than necessary before returning to the stove. "No need for apologies here, Mrs. Dawson. We're well beyond the reaches of Boston society." "You've been to Boston?" she asked, surprised. A small smile touched his lips. "I wasn't born in these mountains, contrary to appearances." Over breakfast, Abigail learned that Keller had come west after the war between the states, having served with the Union Army. He'd worked as a trail guide, a hunter, and eventually saved enough to buy this land 7 years ago. "What brought you to Montana Territory?" he asked, refilling her coffee. "Thomas, my husband, he wanted adventure, and land was cheap." She stared into her cup. "We weren't prepared for how hard it would be," Keller nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Few are, that's why so many leave." "I have nowhere to go," she admitted quietly. He considered her for a long moment. "The storm will keep us housebound for at least 3 days. After that, we'll figure something out." Those 3 days stretched into a week as the blizzard raged on. One of the worst in living memory, according to Keller. They fell into an unexpected routine. He handled the outdoor chores, battling the elements to care for the livestock in the barn, while Abigail took over the cooking and mending his clothes. In the evenings, they sat before the fire, the howling wind their constant companion. At first, conversation was stilted, but gradually they began to share more of themselves. Keller spoke of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his time in the war, and his decision never to return east. Abigail told him of her parents' early deaths, her hasty marriage to Thomas, and her dreams of someday having children of her own. "Do you have family?" she asked one night, remembering the daguerreotype by the bed. A shadow crossed his face. "My mother passed many years ago." "That's her picture you saw. My father, we don't speak. There was a brother once, but typhoid took him when he was 10. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He shrugged, poking at the fire. "That's life out here, you lose people." "Is that why you live alone, to avoid losing more?" His blue eyes met hers, surprise evident in them. "Most people don't question me so directly, Mrs. Dawson. Most people aren't trapped in a blizzard with you, Mr. Hammond," she countered, a small smile playing at her lips. He laughed then, a genuine sound that transformed his face completely. "Fair point." On the 8th day, the storm finally broke, revealing a world buried under feet of snow. The path to town would be impassable for weeks. "What will happen now?" Abigail asked as they stood on the porch, surveying the winter landscape. Keller was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about your situation. I could use help around here cooking, mending, keeping accounts. The cabin where Jonah stays is small but sound. You could stay there until spring, earn enough to decide what's next." Relief washed over her. "I would be most grateful, Mr. Hammond." "Keller," he corrected. "If we're to be sharing this place for months, Mr. Hammond seems overly formal." "Then you must call me Abigail," he nodded, a hint of color touching his cheeks as he turned away. "I'll get the cabin ready for you." The ranch hand's cabin was indeed small, a single room with a bed, table, stove, and chair, but it was clean and sturdy. Keller brought her supplies. Extra blankets, firewood, some books from his own collection. He showed her how to bank the fire to last through the night and promised to check on her each morning. That first night alone in the cabin, Abigail found herself missing the companionship of the main house. She'd grown accustomed to Keller's presence, his deep voice, his thoughtful silences, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was amused but trying not to show it. December gave way to January, and January to February. The winter was harsh, but Abigail discovered an inner strength she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to split kindling, to identify animal tracks in the snow, to predict weather changes by the way smoke rose from the chimney. Keller taught her to shoot the rifle he insisted she keep in her cabin, his hands steady on her shoulders as he corrected her aim. They developed a routine breakfast together in the main house, then separate tasks through the day, coming together again for supper. Sometimes in the evenings, they would read aloud from Keller's books, their voices the only sound beyond the crackling fire and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. It was during one such evening in late February that something shifted between them. Abigail had been reading from Walden when she glanced up to find Keller watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What is it?" she asked, closing the book. He seemed to struggle with his words. "I was just thinking that I've grown accustomed to your voice, to your presence here." Heat rose to her cheeks. "I've grown accustomed to being here." "You're still in mourning," he said carefully. "I don't mean to. Thomas and I," she interrupted. "We were not. It wasn't a love match." The admission surprised even her. "We were fond of each other, but we married because I had no prospects after my parents died, and he needed someone to keep his house while he pursued his ambitions." Keller's eyes never left hers. "I'm sorry, you deserved better." "Perhaps. But I'm here now because of those choices, so I can't regret them entirely." The silence that followed was charged with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Keller stood, moving to stoke the fire. "It's getting late. I should walk you back to your cabin." The remainder of winter passed with a new awareness between them. Small touches, a hand helping her down from the porch, fingers brushing as they passed plates at dinner, lingered longer than necessary. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Abigail found herself watching Keller when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his back as he chopped wood, the gentle way he spoke to his horses, how his face transformed when he smiled. March brought the first signs of thaw. The path to town would soon be passable, and with it came the question of what would happen next. Abigail had saved the wages Keller paid her, enough for a stagecoach ticket east if she chose that path. But as the snow retreated, she found herself reluctant to consider leaving. The ranch had become home in a way her homestead with Thomas never had. And Keller had become something she dared not name, even to herself. On the first truly warm day of spring, Keller suggested they ride to a nearby ridge that offered views of the entire valley. Abigail, now comfortable on horseback thanks to his patient teaching, readily agreed. The landscape was coming alive around them, patches of green emerging from beneath the melting snow, the sound of running water from streams swollen with runoff. They rode side by side, comfortable in their silence. At the ridge, they dismounted and stood looking out over the vast expanse of wilderness and the small cluster of buildings that formed the nearest town, visible as tiny specks in the distance. "It's beautiful," Abigail breathed, the wind lifting tendrils of hair from her face. "Yes," Keller agreed, though when she turned, she found him looking not at the view but at her. "Abigail, he was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Turning, they saw a rider approaching fast along the trail from town. "That's curious," Keller murmured, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. The rider, a young man from town named Eddie Parsons, reined his horse to a stop before them, breathing hard. "Mr. Hammond, Mrs. Dawson, thank goodness I found you. There's trouble. The Blackwood gang has been spotted heading this way." Abigail's blood ran cold. "Blackwood? The same outlaws who have been terrorizing homesteads across the territory," Eddie confirmed. "Sheriff thinks they're the ones who killed your husband, madam." Keller's face hardened. "How many?" "5, according to the reports. They hit a ranch near Helena last week, killed the owner and his son. Sheriff's forming a posse, but he wanted to warn folks in the outlying areas." "Thank you, Eddie. Tell the sheriff I'll be ready if they come my way." As the young man galloped back toward town, Keller turned to Abigail, his expression grave. "We need to get back to the ranch. Now." The ride back was tense, both lost in their own thoughts. For Abigail, the news had reopened wounds she'd thought were healing. The men who'd murdered Thomas were coming, perhaps even now watching them from the tree line. At the ranch, Keller immediately began preparations, checking weapons, securing doors and windows, moving the horses to the most protected corral. "You should stay in the main house tonight," he told her as dusk approached. "The cabin is too isolated if they come." Abigail nodded, fear and something else making her voice tight. "Do you think they'll come here?" "I don't know, but isolated ranches are their preferred targets." He paused in his work, looking at her directly. "Abigail, if they come, I want you to hide in the root cellar. There's a false wall at the back, Jonah's, and I built it as a precaution years ago." "I won't hide while you face them alone," she protested, his expression softened. "I need to know you're safe. I can't," he broke off, running a hand through his hair. "I can't lose you, not now." The admission hung between them, weighted with all they hadn't said these past months. "Keller," she began, but was silenced by his finger against her lips. "Later," he promised. "When this is over, we'll talk about everything. But now I need you to promise me you'll hide if there's trouble." Reluctantly, she nodded. "I promise." Night fell, bringing with it a tense silence. They ate a quiet supper. Then Keller showed her the root cellar and the hidden compartment behind the shelves of preserved vegetables. Satisfied she knew what to do, they returned to the main room where Keller positioned himself by the window, rifle across his lap. Abigail sat across from him, unable to concentrate on the book she'd tried to read. "Tell me about your plans for the ranch," she said finally, needing conversation to break the oppressive silence. Keller glanced at her, a small smile touching his lips. "I want to expand the herd come summer. Maybe build another outbuilding for storage. The roof on the barn needs work before next winter." "It sounds like a good life." "It could be," he agreed softly, "with the right person to share it." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the night's quiet. Keller was on his feet instantly, extinguishing the lamp with one swift movement. "5 riders," he whispered, peering through a crack in the shutters. "It's them. Go to the cellar now." "Keller, go, Abigail, please." Heart pounding, she slipped through the kitchen to the trapdoor in the floor, descending into the earthen cellar as silently as possible. The false wall was where he'd said it would be, and she wedged herself into the narrow space behind it, leaving it slightly ajar to hear what was happening above. The sound of boots on the porch was followed by a heavy knock. "Hello, the house," a voice called, falsely friendly. "We're travelers seeking shelter for the night." She heard Keller's measured steps across the floor, then his voice steady and calm. "I'm afraid I can't accommodate you gentlemen tonight. The town's just 5 miles east. They've got a hotel." "Now that ain't neighborly," the voice replied, hardening. "Especially when we've come so far to see you, Hammond." Abigail's breath caught. They knew his name. "I don't believe we've met," Keller replied coolly, a laugh ugly and sharp. "No, but we met the widow Dawson's husband a few months back. Didn't have much to give us, that one. But he did mention a wealthy rancher nearby before he died. Described this place real nice." The implication was clear. They'd killed Thomas for information about Keller's ranch, likely believing it held more wealth than the modest homestead. "If it's money you want, I keep little cash here," Keller said, "but you're welcome to what I have if you'll be on your way." "Oh, we'll take what you have," the voice promised, "starting with your life if you don't open this door in the next 5 seconds." Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew what would happen next. They would kill Keller as they'd killed Thomas, then search the house for valuables. They would find her. The thought of Keller dying at their hands galvanized her. Moving silently, she reached for the shotgun Keller had placed in the hiding spot. It was loaded, as he'd shown her months ago. With trembling hands, she pushed open the false wall and crept up the cellar stairs. Above, she could hear Keller's voice, still calm but with an edge of steel. "I don't want trouble, but I won't be bullied on my own property. State your real business or leave." "Our business is taking what we want," came the reply. "And right now we want everything you've got." A shot rang out, followed by the sound of splintering wood. They were shooting through the door. Abigail's hands steadied as she reached the kitchen, rage replacing fear. These men had taken her husband, her home, her security. They would not take Keller too. Moving to the side window of the kitchen that overlooked the porch, she saw the outlaw gang concentrated at the front door, their attention fixed on breaking in. One stood slightly apart, keeping watch. Taking careful aim as Keller had taught her, she fired. The blast caught the lookout square in the chest, knocking him backward off the porch. The others whirled in surprise, and in that moment of confusion, the front door burst open from within, Keller charging out with guns blazing. What followed was chaos: gunfire, shouts, the sound of breaking glass. Abigail fired again at a shadow moving along the side of the house, heard a cry of pain. Then silence, broken only by a single set of footsteps approaching the kitchen. "Abigail," Keller's voice strained but alive, she lowered the shotgun, relief flooding through her. "Here." He appeared in the doorway, blood seeping from a graze on his arm but otherwise unharmed. His eyes found hers in the darkness, filled with a mixture of relief and something deeper. "You were supposed to stay hidden." "I couldn't let them kill you," she whispered. In 3 strides he crossed to her, taking the shotgun gently from her hands and setting it aside before pulling her into his arms. She went willingly, the fear and tension of the night dissolving as his strong arms encircled her. "I thought I'd lost you before I had the chance to tell you," he murmured against her hair. "Tell me what?" she asked, though she knew had known for months now. He drew back just enough to look into her eyes. "That I love you, Abigail Dawson. That I want you to stay. Not as my employee or my tenant, but as my wife if you'll have me." In answer, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, then grew deeper as months of unspoken longing found release. His arms tightened around her, lifting her off her feet as they clung to each other in the darkness. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" she laughed, a sound of pure joy despite the night's terrors. "Yes, Keller Hammond." "That is most definitely a yes." Dawn found them on the porch, watching as the sheriff and his men dealt with the aftermath. 3 of the Blackwood gang lay dead, including their leader. A 4th was wounded and bound for prison. The 5th had fled but was unlikely to return. "You two were lucky," the sheriff said, shaking his head. "Most folks who cross paths with the Blackwoods don't live to tell the tale." Keller's arm tightened around Abigail's shoulders. "Luck had little to do with it. Mrs. Dawson here is quite the marksman." The sheriff's eyebrows rose as he tipped his hat to Abigail. "Is that so? Well, madam, you've done this territory a service. These men have been terrorizing folks for too long." After the bodies were removed and statements taken, the sheriff and his men rode back toward town, promising to return in a week with the circuit judge who would want their testimony. Alone again, Keller turned to Abigail, taking both her hands in his. "Are you all right, truly?" She considered the question carefully. The night's events should have left her shattered, but instead she felt a strange peace. "I am. They can't hurt anyone else now." "No," he agreed. "They can't." He hesitated, then added, "I meant what I said last night, Abigail. I want you to stay. Forever." "I want that too," she said softly, "more than anything." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then let's not wait. The circuit judge will be here next week. He can marry us before he leaves." "So soon?" she asked, surprised but not displeased. "I've spent 10 years alone on this ranch, convinced that solitude was all I needed." His blue eyes were earnest as they held hers. "Then a widow knocked on my door in a snowstorm and my life changed forever. I don't want to waste another day without you as my wife." Abigail's heart swelled with love for this strong, gentle man who had saved her in more ways than one. "Then we won't waste another day." They were married the following week in the town's small church, the entire community turning out to witness the union of the solitary rancher and the widow who'd survived the Blackwood gang. The bride wore a simple blue dress borrowed from the minister's wife, and the groom could not take his eyes off her throughout the ceremony. Their life together began that spring, with new calves in the pastures and wildflowers blooming across the valley. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Keller's strength and knowledge of the land, complemented by Abigail's meticulous record-keeping and garden, that soon became the envy of neighboring homesteads. In the autumn, when the aspens turned gold against the mountains, Abigail shared the news that their family would grow by one come spring. Keller's joy was boundless, his protective instincts even more so as he insisted she rest while he took on additional chores. "I'm with child not made of glass," she would laugh as he attempted to prevent her from carrying so much as a basket of eggs. "Humor me," he would reply, stealing a kiss that inevitably led to more. Their daughter, Catherine, was born on a perfect May morning in 1875, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. She was joined 2 years later by a brother, Thomas, named for the man whose death had ultimately led Abigail to Keller's door. Life in the Montana Territory remained challenging: harsh winters, occasional drought, the ever-present dangers of frontier living, but together they built something neither had dared hope for in their earlier lives. A true home, filled with love and laughter. On cold winter nights, they would tell their children the story of how they met a desperate knock on a door during a blizzard, an act of kindness that blossomed into love. They spoke of courage and second chances, of finding strength in the darkest moments. And on the 10th anniversary of that fateful night, Keller presented Abigail with a small wooden box containing the brass doorknob from the original ranch house door, polished to a high shine and mounted on a plaque that read, "The knock that changed everything." "So I never forget," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that the best decision I ever made was opening that door." Abigail, her eyes shining with tears of joy, took his face in her hands. "And the best decision I ever made was finding the courage to knock." Their life together spanned decades. They watched their children grow, welcomed grandchildren, saw the territory become a state. Through it all, they remained each other's strength and solace, the love that began in a snowstorm growing deeper with each passing year. And in the history of the Montana Territory, many would tell tales of outlaws and lawmen, of fortunes made and lost. But few stories were retold as often as that of the widow and the rancher, how grief and compassion forged a love that became legend in the wild, untamed West.